This is the mother of all talk shows, and that means I want to hear from you, particularly if you disagree with my take on events. Either on the telephone 0344 499 1000 or by email via the website at talkradio.co.uk or by texting the word talk and then your message to 87222, though that will cost you 25 pence plus normal sending charges. Perhaps best to tweet at George Galloway at Talk Radio, and don't forget to at both of us. The 11th floor, Garrett Tower in Mile End, on fire. 58 firefighters and the mass evacuation of the residents of the tower all went impeccably. And for that we must be grateful, and we must be grateful too to the firefighter heroes who plunged into that burning building without pausing to renegotiate their terms, in the way of a market economy. If you want me to save the life of your children, to save your most treasured possessions, we'll have to strike a bargain, a contract. Because that's the alternative to having a publicly funded fire service that plunges into the building whoever you are, however much money you're worth. But to have that, you see, you need public spending. You need to reverse the savage cuts in firefighter numbers. You need to pay the firefighters a fair wage. You need to reverse the savage acts of decommissioning fire appliances that subsequent governments and mayors have perpetrated. You need to reverse the sale of fire stations for ritzy residential properties, usually sold to the friends of the mayor. Do you get my drift? And the reason I'm, if you like, fired up about all of this is because I have been associated with the Fire Brigade Union for fully 40 years. 40 years I've been speaking at the Fire Brigade Union's summer schools, weekend schools, marches and demonstrations. I've stood on the top of one of their tenders in Trafalgar Square when they kicked off against a Labour government, an epic strike to try and earn themselves the princely sum of £8.70 an hour for plunging into a burning building for a living. I sat on the benches in the House of Commons when John Prescott, no less, the Deputy Prime Minister, no less, in a Labour government, no less, denounced the firefighters effectively as traitors to the country for demanding their £8.70. John Prescott, I said at the time, wouldn't plunge into a darkened cocktail lounge for £8.70 an hour, which wouldn't keep some of the Labour ministers in cigars for a day. I'm talking later to Lucy Masoud, a firefighter, a woman firefighter, who's the treasurer of the union, because in the inquiry into the Grenfell Inferno, the great crime, the mass slaughter of scores of people, the scorching of the remainder of the lives of hundreds of people, many of them known to me, neighbours of mine. I'm rather concerned, aren't you, at the way the narrative is beginning to shape, where the villains of the piece are beginning to look distinctly like firefighters to me. I may be wrong. The tide may turn as the inquiry goes on. But it smells to me like Hillsborough. It smells to me like the Hillsborough narrative. established by the media in the public's mind and lasting for years, thanks in part to newspapers like The Sun and Kelvin Mackenzie, that somehow the victims of Hillsborough were the criminals. Somehow the Liverpool fans were to blame for what happened to them. It took a long time for that narrative to change, and this very day, a count of 95 cases of manslaughter is to go ahead against the police chief who was acting for the state on the day. So, call me suspicious. I'm always on guard when I see, smell a narrative being shaped. And how's this for a narrative? Immersed in torture. Immersed in torture. That's where stands the Blair Brown Straw Murder Gang this evening. This evening, in the wake of the Intelligence and Security Committee report, brought out by a committee of trustees. You'd never have got me or Jeremy Corbyn given membership of the Intelligence and Security Committee in the House of Commons. This is a report by those trusted not just by our state, but by other states. Do you get my drift? And the report, though Theresa May did her best to wreck it, did her best to obstruct it, allowed a mere handful of the interviewees requested by the committee, allowed the questioning of nobody who might face disciplinary proceedings as a result, is utterly, utterly damning. It damns the Blair and Brown governments, not just as immersed in the torture, as was alleged at the time by His Excellency Craig Murray, the former British ambassador to Uzbekistan, who told us, who told them, who told Jack Straw personally that Britain was profiting from intelligence information coming straight from the torture wheels, coming straight from the torture tables of one of the grimmest dictatorships on the earth. And Britain was breaking its own law as a result. Craig Murray was sacked for highlighting this uncomfortable truth. But Jack Straw, spring-heeled Jack, continued to spring to his feet in the House of Commons and tell the rest of us that we were conspiracy theorists. That's the word he used. I can even give you the Hansard reference. We were conspiracy theorists for alleging that Britain was up to its neck in the blood of the victims of the so-called war on terror. We were lying, said Jack Straw, but it was him who was lying over and over and over and over again, at length, as was his wont, at length. I refer you, if I may, to a video of one of the last speeches I made in the House of Commons. Jack Straw rose to walk out in the middle of my speech, but I didn't allow him to escape so easily. Not so spring-heeled, Jack, now, are you? I said, as you slink from the chamber, your reputation a disgrace. And that's before I saw the ISC Enquiry report. Immersed in torture. Immersed in torture. A Labour government immersed in torture. I leave you with that thought. Except, as Columbo might say, just one more thing. When will these people face trial? When will Jack Straw face trial? When will David Miliband, who lied at the dispatch box, I was sat meters away from him, and I saw his lips move when he told the House that Britain had had no involvement whatsoever in United States illegal renditions to torture, when I knew that we had done exactly that on our base in Diego Garcia. When will Tony Blair face trial? When will Jack Straw face trial? Well, Theresa May did her best to rescue him from his just deserts by paying out millions of pounds to just two of our victims, 2 Libyans, 5 million between them, paid blood money, your money, so that Jack Straw never had to appear in front of a dock, never had to appear in front of a court, never had to be seen as the blood-soaked wretch that he is. His robes now hang about him like a wretched thief and torturer. Jack Straw, as long as God gives me breath, I will pursue you. Tony Blair, as long as God gives me breath, I will pursue you. I'll pursue you until the last day of my life, and after me, my sons, my daughters, and my friends. This is the mother of all talk shows. First song I ever played for my darling wife before she agreed. But it would be nice. It's a Beach Boys day because it's mad hot outside. It's beach weather. But for those of us at work, well, we can just imagine what it might be like to be surfing USA. An unknown texter with no name says, thousands of British jobs are now at risk because of you Brexit fanatics. Are you going to contribute to the redundancy packages with your Murdoch wages? Well, Mr. Gutless coward who can't even put your name on the end of a text, my Murdoch wages wouldn't be much of a contribution. In fact, you'd laugh how you would laugh if you knew how little Murdoch wages I was getting to present this show with all of my energy, all of my experience, all of my erudition, and all of my heart. Much more importantly than that inane, bovine text, I'm speaking now with Lucy Masoud, who's the treasurer of the aforementioned Fire Brigades Union. Her members were fighting yet another tower block blaze in the East End of London today, and she is doing her bit at the front line at the Grenfell Enquiry. Lucy, welcome to the show.
Hello, George. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for coming on board. I started my monologue by talking about my anxiety. It's more than anxiety, actually. That the firefighters are being set up for the fall in the Grenfell Enquiry. I don't understand why they've started with the issues and witnesses that they've started with. It would have made more sense to me if they had started with what the cause of this fire was, rather than how the firefighters tackled it. What's your feeling on that?
I tend to agree, actually. The Fire Brigades Union put out a statement yesterday stating that what we would have liked to have seen first is, the causes of the fire, what led up to the fire, and, deregulation, laws in place that allowed that kind of cladding and that kind of refurbishment to take place in the first place. As the Fire Brigades Union, we're completely open to have our members questioned We think they did an amazing job, those brave men and women who ran into that building as everyone else was running the other way on the 14th of June last year. We have no hesitation of putting our members on the stand and allowing them to answer those questions, and they will do so with dignity, as they have done up until now. I think what's more concerning, George, is the way that some mainstream media are portraying the answers and attempting to portray some of the firefighters in a certain light.
Well, that's true, Lucy, and we'll come back to that. But, of course, the people who set up the inquiry are not naives. They know how the mainstream media will treat it.
Absolutely. And, we are where we are at the moment. My union has full participation status, so we will be playing a big part in this inquiry. We'll be making our own submissions as well, as will our barrister. Certainly, we're doing our own investigation from an FBU point of view. Our members who will be taking the stand, as I say, they've been absolutely incredible. Certainly, the two who are on the stand today, Dan and David, very close friends of mine. Absolutely heartbreaking to watch him. What he went through on that night, just incredible. And then to have to see him relive it today. And we're talking about someone who not only went in there to attempt to save people's lives, these are people he knew, George. These are people he grew up with, because he grew up on that estate. He knows these people personally. And then to go in there and try and save these people and to be unable to, and then to be put under scrutiny and inquiry and have to relive it, just absolutely incredible. He did an amazing job, though. He's a good man. He's a heroic man. And I think he just came across with so much dignity.
Indeed. And all your members have, including the Michael Dowden interrogation, which was dignity personified. He looked and sounded like dignity personified. But the media treatment of that interrogation was deeply disturbing, and was where I began to move from anxiety to anger, really.
Yes, it was very concerning to see. I mean, straight off the bat, they were describing him as a fire chief, a senior officer. George, he's a watch manager. He's a junior officer. He really should have only been in charge of 2 fire engines, 4 at the most. And instead, he was in charge of the biggest incident we've had since the Second World War, with the largest loss of life. He did an absolutely incredible job. Even when he handed over control to other senior officers, he carried on doing his job. He carried on saving people. And but for the actions of him and his colleagues, those brave men and women who went into that building on that day, but for their actions, many people, more people would have lost their lives. To see these media types, these keyboard peckers, as I call them, quick to throw out the criticisms, and not only the media, George. Certain people in the legal profession, shall we say,
yes,
making accusations and comments about the integrity of the firefighters, absolutely disgraceful, and they should know better. And what they're doing is they're undermining the process of the inquiry. But not only that, they're taking away the focus of what caused that fire, and they're trying to shift it on the firefighters. It was not the firefighters who put flammable cladding on that building. It was not the firefighters who installed combustible windows or installed fire doors that were not fit for purpose. It was not the firefighters who closed down 10 fire stations in London, took away 29 fire engines and sacked 1,000 firefighter jobs. And it was not the firefighters who cut fire cover in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea by 50%.
50%?
50% in the borough of Kensington and Chelsea alone. The fire cover in that area has been reduced by 50% in the last 7 years, I believe it is. It's absolutely, astonishing. And of course, people will say, it has no effect on our response to Grenfell. We don't know that. We'll have to wait until the end of the inquiry. What I would say is that even before Grenfell, fire deaths in London were up by 40% in 1 year, and that was the year leading up to Grenfell. So even before Grenfell, we're seeing fire deaths go up by 40%. If I was a resident living in London, which I am actually, I'd be very concerned that the fire cover for my city is not anywhere near as adequate.
Well, you see, to argue that cutting spending on fire services in a borough by 50% had no impact on the fire services' ability to fight fires in the borough. If you take the logic of that, I mean, that would mean eliminating fire spending would equally have no impact. It's absurd. It's a logical absurdity. Now, you say it wasn't the firefighters who did all that. Let me tell the listeners, in case they haven't already worked it out, who it was that did all that. It was Boris Johnson, who was rewarded for it by being made the Foreign Secretary of Britain.
You're absolutely right. Yes, and I make a point of whenever I talk about Boris Johnson and what he did as Mayor of London. Now, bearing in mind, George, when he was making these cuts, when he was savaging the service that I love so much and have worked for 12 years, my union came out and we said, if you make these cuts to the fire service, if you close these fire stations, if you take away these fire engines, it will cost lives. And we were poo-pooed. We said, no, you're talking rubbish. It won't make any effect at all. Response times will be down. We've still managed to get to these fires in time. Since these closures have happened, since these cuts have taken place, year on, you've seen the statistics have said the complete opposite of what the government have said and completely in line of what we said. If you make cuts to frontline services, emergency services, people's lives will be lost. And we've seen that so tragically at Grenfell Tower.
We've had massive police cuts, massive fire service cuts. We've got massive pressure on the NHS, all frontline services, on which, but for the grace of God, we could all be depending on tonight.
Absolutely. And I think what we see time and time again is the government really relying on our goodwill. As public sector workers, we don't join this job for money. I didn't become a firefighter for money. God knows if, I'd be crazy to join this job for money. It's decent paid, but it's not a job that you can comfortably live on. You join a job like the fire service, the police, the ambulance service. You do it for the simple reason that you want to help people. And the government take advantage of that because they know that they can slash the funding to your service. They can make your terms and conditions unbearable, and you will still continue to do it. And that's exactly what we will do. Obviously, my union, on occasions, we have been forced to take industrial action. We do that, very, very rarely, and we do it at the last possible opportunity. But what I find most unpalatable, and I've said this previously, is in the days after Grenfell, you had the Prime Minister come out and you had our government come out and hail us all as heroes, telling the whole country how amazing the firefighters were who dealt with Grenfell Tower and how amazing the emergency services was. Yet it was that same Prime Minister and her same government who sat on the front benches of the House of Commons less than 10 days later and cheered as they voted to maintain the cap on the public pay. And I think that shows you and your listeners the absolute contempt that not only this government, but consecutive governments hold their emergency services and their public sector workers in.
Well, there's a big demonstration tomorrow to defend the National Health Service. Will you be going along, Lucy?
I'm at a course in Holborn, but I will definitely be popping in at some stage. I will certainly dip my toe in, so to speak. But yes, I will be there at some stage.
Fantastic to talk to you. Thank you very much indeed. Lucy Masoud, who is the treasurer of the Fire Brigade Union. Quite an able advocate for the union, I must say. This is the mother of all talk shows. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. You call us, we'll call you back. Needn't cost you more than a penny or two. And you can speak to the nation and beyond. One man who's been speaking since the very beginning of the war on terror most eloquently is journalist and broadcaster John Wright, who joins me now. John, welcome to the show.
Good evening, George.
It was a red letter day, wasn't it? The red standing for blood. Even the trustees on the ISC, and even notwithstanding all the blockages that Theresa May put in their way, the report is utterly damning, isn't it?
Oh, it could not have been any more damning, George. I don't know if you've had the time to read it in all of its particulars, but I have, and what the committee found was that there were 596 individual cases of the UK security services obtaining intelligence from detainees who'd been tortured or suffered mistreatment, with 2 cases of direct involvement. And they also found that the UK had paid for 3 rendition flights under the rubric of the War on Terror. So this could not be any more scathing. However, I would suggest that there is a worrying pattern that's developed with these inquiries and these reports. If you consider the Chilcot report of 2016, which came as close as it was possible to come to in indicting Tony Blair for the international crime of aggression, which unfortunately is not in English law. That was tested by a former Iraqi general in a private prosecution in 2017, Abdul Wahid al-Rabat, and that was denied. But it's certainly for misleading Parliament. But we see the pattern whereby these reports are released. There are a flurry of condemnatory opinion pieces in the media. Social media comes alive with condemnation, calling for justice, and then the caravan moves on. And so what we have, George, in the post-9/11 era is not justice, but it's simulacrum. We have the appearance rather than the reality. And it suggests to me that these inquiries are used as something that's consonant with a political safety valve to beguile us into thinking that we live in societies where justice does not discriminate between those who have wealth and power and those who do not. So unless action is taken, unless these kind of reports initiate criminal proceedings, then I'm afraid we're dealing with appearance rather than the reality of justice.
Well, I agree with that. Of course, that doesn't diminish their shock value. And the criminal law is one thing, but Parliament has its own law. One of the things that is abundantly clear, and I've only read the summary, you've read the whole thing, is that there was a systematic deception of Parliament on this issue by Jack Straw, by David Miliband on one occasion, by Jack Straw at length on many occasions. And unless you believe that Jack Straw was keeping from Tony Blair these uncomfortable facts that were being contradicted by Tony Blair at the dispatch box, the offence of deliberately misleading Parliament seems to me to have already been established in this report. Now you may say, what can they do now? Blair has moved on, Straw has moved on, not to where he wanted to be, but for a Channel 4 dispatches programme with a camera up the jumper, catching him looking for a Chinese takeaway from a fictional Chinese company, he'd have been in the House of Lords by now. But both of them remain members of the Privy Council. They laughably carry around the title Right Honourable in front of their names. Surely they should be at least dragged before the bar of the House of Commons. And if you don't mind me mentioning one other thing, both of them are still carrying Labour Party membership cards in their pockets.
Well, people listening to this may believe that the past is the past, and these reports will do, and these individuals, Jack Straw, who, by the way, he asserted that anyone who believed that the British government was complicit in torture were guilty of conspiracy theory.
Yes. I've even just put out the Hansard reference where he did so at length.
Indeed. But it's really important that justice is not only served, but is seen to be served for 2 reasons, very important reasons. One is it acts as a deterrence. I have no doubt that if Tony Blair was held fully accountable for his decisive role in the catastrophe that was visited on the people of Iraq, then I don't think David Cameron would have entered into the debacle in Libya in 2011, because it would have been a deterrence. He would have thought twice about the fate that might meet him, given the fate that met Tony Blair, if he had been held fully accountable. But without accountability, it also feeds the grievance that is the oxygen of extremism and radicalisation, which blows back on us in the form of terrorist atrocities. And this is why justice has to be served in these cases, that we can't just let it go, that we can't just be satisfied with the demonisation and the calumniation of these individuals. We need to see them face criminal accountability for their actions, which have resulted in the destabilization of the Middle East and wholesale slaughter of hundreds of thousands in Iraq, perhaps up to 1 million people, mass refugee crises, and economic dislocation, resulting from which is international terrorism, which has been rampaging across Syria and just which has been emanating from that region into our own cities and towns.
Well, you're absolutely right. They haven't faced accountability. Indeed, Tony Blair's gone on to be worth £100 million. He can summon the cameras anytime he wants to make an ex cathedra statement. I suspect that Spring-Heeled Jack will never be heard from again, but who knows? Campbell, the propagandist in chief for the Iraq war, is everywhere. He's running glossy magazines. He's on television anytime he wants. He's lionized as some great figure in British public life.
Yes.
And so these things, as you say, when they're looking for reasons to explain why so many, and it is actually an uncomfortable large number, of young Muslims have been radicalized, fanaticized, they need look no further than these 2 or 3 people.
Indeed. Here we have to impugn the mainstream media, because you're absolutely right. Not only have Messrs Straw and Campbell and Blair not faced accountability, not faced criminal proceedings for their role in the disasters that we've been discussing, they've been rehabilitated by the liberal mainstream media. Tony Blair has been allowed to pontificate on all matters concerning Brexit, concerning international terrorism, concerning peace in the Middle East.
Yes.
That's how absurd it's become. Alistair Campbell has been similar. He's been treated as a sage, as a political commentator of note. He's always wheeled on the BBC or Sky News for his opinion on these issues, and so on and so on.
And both of them are wheeled on to attack Corbyn, who opposed every one of these crimes.
Indeed. And the only people who suffered any consequences over Iraq, because I think Iraq is inextricably linked to this report on UK complicity in torture, who did suffer consequences, yourself, Greg Dyke, and various others, Dr. David Kelly. These are the people who faced consequences. Piers Morgan, for daring to oppose the catastrophe. It does seem to suggest that we are living in an upside-down world when it comes to holding establishment figures to account, George.
Well, 4 of us lost our jobs: Piers Morgan, Andrew Gilligan, Greg Dyke and me. And Dr. David Kelly lost his life, a far, far graver fate, whilst the people who carried out the crimes have gone on to more profitable pastures. I'm just wondering if this report, especially given, I mean, we shouldn't underestimate how many obstacles Theresa May put in its way. I think she allowed only 4 people out of 26 that were requested by the committee to be interviewed, and nobody could be interviewed that might suffer disciplinary consequences if they did. I mean, this was a rearguard action by the Tory government of a committee led by a Tory, the redoubtable Dominic Grieve, which was looking into the actions of a Labour government, proving what you and I have always said, that the state is quite a seamless beast. There's no real difference, or hasn't been up to now, in Labour and Conservative when it came to foreign policy and war.
There's been an ironclad consensus, but you made mention of Dominic Grieve. He deserves great credit, because the role of Theresa May, he did not seek to elide that in his report. In fact, he made it very central. Yeah. He flagged up the way that he was obstructed, the committee was obstructed in carrying out its tasks, in carrying out a full inquiry. So that's a very significant statement on his part, and as I say, he deserves great credit.
He does. He's a proper parliamentarian. If Parliament was filled with people like him, it would be a far better Parliament.
Indeed, it would. And here also, I must spare a thought for Julian Assange, who, as we speak, is still in a state of de facto solitary confinement in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. He's there for the crime, quote unquote crime, of doing what what a self-respecting media should have been doing, which is investigating the high crimes of the rich and powerful and exposing them to the public. He, again, has suffered enormously for his role in exposing those crimes, including the crimes that were committed against the people of Iraq.
Well, more than 5 years in a room in what is called an embassy, but is in fact only a large flat, and he's in one room of it. But you say like a solitary confinement, at least a prisoner in solitary confinement gets to use the telephone box. Assange cannot receive calls or make calls now. He's literally being held in what has become a black prison, like one of the prisons in the rendition process.
Indeed he has. As I've said before, there is a difference between believing that you live in a free society and acting as if you do. Julian Assange's mistake was in acting as if he did. And my word, is he paying the price?
He is. John White, commentator, broadcaster, writer. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. 0344 499 1000. Especially if you disagree with me, it says here, I should say. 0344 499 1000. That's the number to call. You can also email me, text me, or tweet me at George Galloway at Talk Radio. Stuart, I've read. Let's see. This is Thomas. I've read that one too. Byron Ashton. George, you have changed the character of my Friday night listening. I no longer listen to any questions on Radio 4. I stay with the mother of all talk shows for the duration. Well done, George, and thank you. Byron Ashton in Wales. Byron, that's very touching, and I'm grateful for it. Whatever happened to my application to be the next host of BBC Question Time? They didn't get back to my agent yet. I'm serious about this. My fedora is in the ring. I'll tell you this, it wouldn't be question time if I was running it. It would be answer time. I just remember Senator John McCain singing that tune to the words, "Let's bomb Iran, bomb Iran." I'm not joking, I'm not making that up. Peter says on SMS, "Dear George, where have you been? You're the only person worth listening to on this station. And when you're not on, I'm stuck with a local London station. You're the only person I consider a non-agenda driven. You say what other presenters fear to say, the truth. I said previously I never liked you. That was before I listened to you. Blame the mainstream media for turning me against you. Today's journalists and politicians lack honesty and integrity. Thank you for renewing my faith, and sorry for prejudging you." Thank you, Peter. Very, very kind of you to say so. Actually, there are many people on this radio station worth listening to, and I can't think of any that would be worth turning over to that local London station instead for. The Red Resistance says, "Great to see you on the fabulous Lee Camp show. I know time was limited. Shame you didn't have time to fill Lee in about the Salisbury farce. I'm sure his comedic brilliance would have latched onto it. Keep up the great work, Top Cat, and never change." Thank you. That's my pinned tweet at the moment. My interview with the legendary Lee Camp on RT America. I thoroughly enjoyed it, actually. He's a top man, one of the very best. Now, Hassan says, "I'm spreading news of the mother of all talk shows as the alternative to right-wing radio. I listen each and every week." Thanks, Hassan. Andrew says, "Dear George, one could draw the conclusion that the Windrush scandal is a deliberate action by the EU directing the Home Office to create social disruption." I wouldn't go that far. Terry Eaton says, "You don't need to explain yourself, George, to the public regarding your defence of British firefighters. We all know the Tories will blame anyone for their sad and sorrowful ineptitude." Terry, it's a good point, but actually, in my lifetime, the worst governments that have mistreated Britain's firefighters have been Labour governments. Barry in Enfield says, "George, thanks for your support to the fire service. I'd like to show my support to a fellow brother, Michael Dowden. Also, this World Cup in Russia that our government told us not to go to has been fantastic." Well snuck in there, Barry. It's so funny. I mean, you don't know whether to laugh or cry. If it had been left up to Stephen Kinnock, England wouldn't have been at the World Cup. And as it is, the Russian people are having to go without the presence of British dignitaries, I think they call them. John Hodgkins sent an email. George, well, you've got to hand it to Trump. He's dredged up the ultimate Russophobe deep state insider from the bottom of the swamp and converted him into a peacemaker. John Bolton has just been to Moscow talking friendship and cooperation with Putin. Trump seems to have calculated that if he can get the most anti-Russian political figure on side, then his apparent policy of restoring cordial relations with Moscow might just succeed in making the world a more peaceful place. Very, very clever. Well, John, I'll need a reserve judgment on that one. John Bolton as a peacemaker, though I must say the headline, the mother of all headlines, was yesterday's in the Times. Fears grow of peace deal between the United States and Russia. In 100 years, that will be taught in the history classes of a measure of the madness to which we had descended. Fears grow of a peace deal between America and Russia. Richard Case says, well said and disgusting. These people have gotten away with these crimes. And Lizzie says, as usual, I'm cheesed off. I hear the announcement for someone to come and disagree with you, and I listen to your epic rant with fevered ear, and I can't find a single thing I disagree with. Thank you, Lizzie. I think Lubna says, hallelujah, George Galloway on Talk Radio, best 3 hours. Please join right now. Terry Eaton says, a disgraceful Labour government, including Blair and Straw. A shame for me, a lifelong socialist, to have these traitors and their ilk represent me. The reason I left the party until Corbyn was elected leader. Richard says, typical government forgetting the source, their lack of proper protection in these buildings where such a tragedy started. And Stuart says, good evening, George. If the liberal Guardianista Russiaphobes were hoping the World Cup would be a tidal wave of racism, violence and imaginary gangs of neo-Nazis rampaging around Moscow, beating up gay folk, well, they could not have been more wrong. This is probably the best organised and friendly World Cup ever, and we must thank the Russian people for that. Top notch, I say. Me too, Stuart. In fact, I'll go further, and I've seen a lot of World Cups. I'll say already, this is the best World Cup there has ever been. This building, filled with my colleagues who serve us, who love football so well on TalkSport, is literally rocking and rolling with the absolutely majestic World Cup that there has been. And our correspondents out there are being treated right royally. Well, you know what I mean, not like the Russian royal family were treated. But a red carpet has been rolled out for them. And Thomas from Camden says, hi George, 81 knife and gun crimes being investigated by the Met Police so far this year. That's actually 81 murders, I think, Thomas. And the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, mumbles his way through interviews, only some interviews. He won't do other interviews. In total denial about the serious state of affairs on the streets of London. Simple question, George. What's the point of having a London mayor? Not much if that London mayor is Mr. Khan. Right, the number is 0344 499 1000. I need your calls, or the owners will think there's nobody listening. And we're going to take a break now, and we're going to talk more about the Labour government that ended up immersed in torture. Unsociable Socialist says, it's back. Time for the one and only broadcast in Britain today where the left's voice isn't shouted down. Thank God for GG. Any chance you will go on the Jimmy Dore show? Well, I'd asked my able producer, the redoubtable Cass, but she's just nipped out because she's just seen on the news that there's a crumpet crisis and she cannot go a day without crumpet. Being a man of my age and class, I zipped my lips at that statement that she made as she fled. The Red Resistance says, glad you mentioned the NHS Saturday 70 March, George. Strangely, it doesn't seem to be getting the MSM blanket coverage that was afforded the Stop Brexit parade last weekend. I can't think why. I cannot forswear to mention Waitrose on parade last Saturday. I was in Malta, and that's why I wasn't on the show last week, commemorating a very great victory for the dockers, the working class people in Malta. But I watched an awful lot of footage. I couldn't listen to it because their soft shoes didn't make much of a noise. I could almost smell the expensive cologne from the television screen. What do we want? More crumpets. When do we want them? Now. From Waitrose, if you please, might have been their slogan. But the point is, as has been made by the Red Resistance in that tweet, this demonstration, which Alistair Campbell and Tony Blair said the government would have to listen to, even though we fielded, even by their numbers, 20 times that number to try and stop the Iraq war, and Blair and Campbell treated us with absolute contempt. It was said from Ward 5 by Andrew Adonis and others like him, Professor Grayling, that there had to be a people's vote, but we were never offered a people's vote on the Iraq war that we're discussing this evening. If we'd been offered a people's vote, 1 million people might still be alive who are dead today. ISIS, which is rampaging around the world, might never have been born, might never have existed if we'd had a people's vote on the Iraq war, if the government had listened to a demonstration in London, in our case of 2 million, in their case, on their numbers, 100,000 people. But I never saw a more prosperous, more smug, more, if you like, au pair kind of demonstration than I did on the screen from Malta last weekend. But the point that Red Resistance is making is that it got utterly endless media coverage. Now, there's a mass demonstration in London tomorrow on the anniversary of the foundation of the NHS to draw attention to the state of absolute crisis that exists within the service. Have you seen, read, heard any media coverage of that demonstration? Because I certainly haven't. Let's take the first call from Andrew in Hull. Go ahead, Andrew.
All right, George, first time I've ever rang you.
You're welcome.
Pleased to speak to you.
Thank you.
I'm a socialist. I am about the same age as you. I'm a crippled lorry driver.
Okay.
And I've been ill for a long time.
Okay, mate.
So I've listened to, obviously, commentary over the years about all sorts of things. It's all I do, basically. I've never been able to vote for Labour, not since Margaret Thatcher. I realise that the system that we vote in is rigged, and the only way the Labour Party wins is if they acquiesce to the right.
Yeah, if they become non-Labour.
Absolutely. That's the only way that we can win. Right, so I've never been able to vote Social. I've never been able to vote Labour. Tony Blair, close for, that was the end of the Labour Party for me. Because to me, owning our own utilities, our NHS, the railways, are a fundamental right for all those that live in this country. They were built and bought by the populace, for the populace. And the Tories and the Labour Party have consistently sold us out. Sold the railways to French, Germans, whatever.
Including the state railway companies in other people's countries.
Absolutely. And to me, that has been the death of this country. What I would like to ask you, George, because I'm a Remainer, right?
Yep.
Practically a Remainer, because I did believe that he stopped us from going to war. And the thing that makes me fearful now, and this is a genuine fear, the right wing of the Conservative Party, and I know you want to get out the EU and you want to
tomorrow. I've lost all
do.
patience with these so-called negotiations.
Absolutely. But what I'm trying to get through to you is that I understand where you're coming from. Most of the people that I live around voted to come out. The thing that I'm fearful for, seeing Trump in the White House, actually believe that we're heading for this. And I think the right wing of the Conservative Party, we've already lost this. That's why this thing that they did the other day, Dominic Breed did not stand up to her. And that's where we've lost, from my point of view, that's where we've lost the vote and everything. And I believe that the stalling and everything that's been going on now is because we will leave with no deal.
I want to leave with no deal. Let me tell you why. I want to leave with no deal. I said 2 years ago that we should have left with no deal right away with an email saying we're out of here. I don't want to pay £50 billion as an exit fee from a club that the vast majority of our citizens have not benefited from at all, not least your neighbours in Hull and in the rest of post-industrial Britain. I drove down the Mall tonight, Andrew, and it's festooned with Royal Air Force flags. It was quite moving for me.
Yeah.
And I tweeted immediately a picture of the flags. In 1940 and 1941, only the Royal Navy and the Royal Air Force stood in the way of absolute, complete
My
victory.
grandfather was in the Royal Navy.
Well, there you go.
They're
the only things that saved Britain and therefore saved the entire world. Because at that time, neither America nor the then Soviet Union had any intention of coming into the war.
Absolutely.
If it was not for us and if it was not for them. And in this midsummer, I always remember the fighting in the skies above our country of these brave pilots and all the workforce on the ground that kept them flying. It's nobody hates unnecessary war any more than me. I'm not in second place to you on this.
I know.
By the way, the countries that are now lecturing us, warning us, threatening us, were many of them either literally on the side of the people that we were fighting in the skies above Britain.
I don't disagree with this, George.
Or folded like cheap tents in ours.
Absolutely.
As the Wehrmacht swept across the European plains. So I find it difficult to listen to lectures from Junkers and the rest.
I absolutely agree with you, George. But my fundamental point is, it is not a perfect system. But I actually do believe that we are in danger of turning back to the 30s. You can only see. There's another thing. Trump is a despot. He has leanings, and if the American people.
But Andrew, listen. Trump is the president of America, whether we are in the European Union or whether we are out of the European Union. The right wing of the Conservative Party are the right wing of the Conservative Party, whether we are in the European Union or out of the European Union. Capitalism is capitalism, whether we're in or out. Existed before, exists after. None of these things are reasons for staying in the European Union. Because if we stay in the European Union, Trump remains the president of the United States. The difference between staying and leaving is this. If we leave, we have the chance to elect a government that can do the things that need to be done. If we stay in the European Union, that chance is legally and constitutionally forbidden to us. If we leave, we can elect Jeremy Corbyn. We can renationalise our public services. We can refuse to put our public services out to competitive tender to every capitalist entity in the European Union. I told you I was in Malta last week. I was stood in a dock that used to be called the Red China Dock because it was built in a cooperation between Dom Mintoff, one of the great European leaders of my lifetime, and the government of China. It employed then 1,000 people, and the workers ran the dock themselves. When Malta joined the European Union, it was not allowed to continue to have the workers running the docks themselves. It was forced to put the docks up for competitive tender. And a private company, surprise, surprise, won the competitive tender. And now instead of 1,000 dockers in Malta, there's 100 dockers in Malta. And the workers not only don't run the docks, they don't even have proper recognition and negotiating rights with their employer. That's the difference between remaining and leaving. Now that's the America we love. It's the America I grew up loving. The beach, the sunshine, the ocean, the surfboards, the beach boys, and so much else. But of course, as one gets older, one sees another side to America, though not quite as much of the other side as we ought, and as, to be fair, we now are beginning to. I watched a magnificent programme made by my old colleague Abby Martin this very morning on her Empire Files series about the history of the labour movement, the workers' movement, socialism in the United States. A truly magnificent piece of work. And so I'm very much looking forward to talking with Professor Peter Kuznick, who is the author of The Untold History of the United States. He joins me now from Bethesda, Maryland, United States of America. Peter, thanks very much for joining us again.
I'm glad to be here. Actually, I'm the co-author of The Untold History of the United States. Oliver Stone, the filmmaker, is my co-author.
And everyone interviews him. Everyone interviews him. That's why I wanted to interview you. But you are the co-author, and he's a very great man, but so are you. So I should have said co-author, but now that I have, tell us about the astounding insight which this untold history has provided. What would surprise our listeners most when told the previously untold history of the United States?
What would surprise the listeners the most? Well, I guess
it's the land of the free. We're brought up to believe it's the land of the free, the home of the brave.
There are a lot of there is a certain kind of freedom in the United States that is admirable, that we have to fight to retain, that we got because we fought for it in the first place. And the land of the home of the brave, I suppose there are a lot of brave Americans, not the ones who sit behind desks, behind computers 3,000 miles away or 10,000 miles away and drop bombs or direct drones. Those aren't the ones who I consider the brave Americans. But the United States does have, one of the proud parts of American history is the U.S. role in World War II, the U.S. role in defeating fascism. A lot of brave people risked their lives, and a lot of brave people died in helping defeat fascism.
Absolutely.
But even that is clouded in mythology in the United States. You ask Americans who won World War II in Europe, and they'll say that the United States did. Of course, the Russians were the ones who fought and died and won the war in Europe. They don't understand what ended World War II in Japan either. They think the atomic bombs. Obama goes to Hiroshima, which was a great thing. He should have done it earlier. I applauded that he went. And he says that World War II came to its brutal end in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Nonsense. That's not what ended the war. What changed the equation and forced the Japanese to surrender was a Soviet invasion of Manchuria. As the Japanese prime minister says, they're going to be in Hokkaido tomorrow. We have to surrender now when we can surrender to the Americans. I mean, there's a lot of history there. But I guess probably the thing that's most astounding is how avoidable the whole Cold War was. How many times we came close to ending it and how close we came to avoiding it in the first place. So not only the nuclear age, which still continues to threaten us, our species, and all life on our planet with extinction, but the Cold War itself almost was avoided and could have been avoided and could have been ended much, much earlier. And think how much better off the world would have been if we had put those resources and that talent, that human power, that intelligence toward life instead of toward preparing for death the way we did.
We'll come back to that point because you're talking to a man who saw a headline in the Times, no less, yesterday, which really ought to be memorialized. The headline was, "Fears grow over peace deal between the United States and Russia." But I want to put this thesis to you. I hold it. It's a controversial one, even here. I guess it must be more controversial over there. I do not believe that my country has fired an honorable shot since 1945. In other words, our finest hour was our role in defeating fascism in the Second World War. But every shot we've fired anywhere in the world ever since has covered us with dishonor. Would you say the same about the United States?
I would have to think if I believe that every shot that we fired covers us with this dishonor, but the general thesis sounds correct to me. There must be something that we've done that was necessary and noble and on the right side.
It's just but neither of us can remember it.
Case after case, we've been on the wrong side, and we've been there together, our two countries, certainly since 1945. You look at the major interventions.
Yeah. I mean, Peter, between 1945 and the one you're about to mention, Korea, we were murdering people in Malaya. We were murdering people in the Arab world. We were murdering people trying to hold on to an empire that was ebbing away. And you were murdering people to try and create an empire. And for a country that was born, yours, in a revolution against empire, you haven't half built a big empire yourselves.
And for a long time, the United States denied that it was an empire. But once the neocons took power under the George W. Bush administration, after the invasion of Afghanistan, anticipating the invasion of Iraq, they started to openly talk about empire. The New York Times on January 5th, 2003, headlined its Sunday magazine section, "American Empire, Get Used to It." And the neocons were then not just denying that we were an empire, saying we were the most powerful empire in history, and we should be proud of that fact. It was Charles Krauthammer, who recently passed away, one of the leading neocon thinkers, who declared back in 1990 that this was a unipolar moment, that the United States had now vanquished all competitors, eliminated all foes, and was standing as the world's hegemon. And he said this could last for decades. Then in 2003, and after the successful invasion of Afghanistan, he says that it's the unipolar era. We've gone from the unipolar moment to the unipolar era. He says it may last indefinitely. Well, it didn't last very long. By 2005, Krauthammer says, well, it's the unipolar moment again, and even that now is looking shaky. So the world has gone from unipolarity, even just a few years ago, when Oliver Stone and I finished our first draft of Untold History, the 12 documentary episodes, and our 800-page book. That was 2012. And now we're just coming out with the new edition in which we've written a new chapter that covers 2012 to 2018, and look at how different the world looks in that short period of time. Back in 2012, it did look like a certain kind of unipolarity was still the case. Now that's a distant dream for the United States or for the neocons and the imperialists. So the world has changed dramatically. It's now a much more multipolar world, and there are forces that are resisting the United States successfully. I'm going to be doing a speaking tour in England from July 10th, July 11th to July 18th, and would like to have you join us, George.
Yes, where are you speaking?
Imperialism on Trial speaking tour. Greg Sharkey is organizing
Greg's
it.
An old friend of mine, yeah.
Yes, and I know he'd love very much for you to join us. We're speaking in London on the 11th at the Bloomsbury Baptist Church, in Birmingham on the 12th at the Quaker Meeting House, in Liverpool on the 15th at the Irish Center, and in Manchester on the 16th at the Irish Center. And a lot of folks you know are going to be part of this. The London event is with Eva Bartlett, Peter Ford, Neil Clark, Adam Gary, and a couple others, and we're hoping that you'll be amongst those.
It's a great lineup, and I'll definitely join you for some of them, Peter. I can't do them all, but this headline I talked about, this fears grow over peace deal between the United States and Russia, which, as I say, will in times to come be immortalized as a sign of incipient madness in certain quarters. That madness is getting more and more anxious, isn't it? Because isn't the truth, it's an uncomfortable truth for many, maybe most, on the left, especially on the more liberal part of the left, that Trump's actual instinct is to have peace with Russia. And the deep state and the liberals in this weird confluence are determined to destroy Trump before he can actually do it. What do you think of that?
I think that Donald Trump is like the broken clock that gets the correct time twice a day. Well, Donald Trump is wrong on almost everything he touches, except for what he's doing now in terms of Korea, and except for what he's doing in terms of Russia. For some reason, which I don't profess to be able to explain, Donald Trump, whose instincts are terrible and whose temperament is terrible, I find much of what he does deplorable, but he is right when it comes to the summit with Korea, and his instincts on Russia are right. You know, people debate why he's right on that. Is it the PP tape? Do they have that dossier on him? Is it because of his financial ties to Russia? I don't care what the issue is. The United States and Russia have between us 93% of the world's nuclear weapons. It is absolutely essential, it's incumbent upon us that we find some way to resolve the tensions. There's more tension between the U.S. and Russia now than there's been at any time since probably the Cuban Missile Crisis, but certainly since the 80s or the early years of the Reagan administration. We've got ongoing conflicts, not only in Syria, not only in Ukraine and Crimea, but also in the Baltics, where we've got this new regiments of NATO troops there lined up against the Russian troops on the other side. The Russians have moved this nuclear-capable Iskander missiles into Kaliningrad in order to resist the incursion by NATO into that region. There's the demonization of Putin going on. We saw the same thing throughout the Cold War. the idea that it begins with NSC 68, the American Strategy Doctrine from 1950, which bases U.S. policy not on what Russia is likely to do, not on what Russia would do in a sane world, but what Russia is capable of doing if its leaders were the most malevolent, evil people on the planet, and they had this vision of global conquest. And based on that, the United States quadruples its defense spending during the Korean War. But they couldn't get that through without the Korean War having started. But now we have this same idea about Russia and Putin, that they are forces of evil and malevolence who are out for world conquest. I haven't seen it. I don't see any evidence of it. What happens in Ukraine and Crimea, to me, is perfectly understandable in a very, very different context and conceptual framework. We don't need to be going to this demonization, which is so unhealthy and so dangerous. So I think that Trump wants to meet with Putin, and that we could come away with some real tangibles from that is very exciting. One of the things I look forward to is an extension of the New START Treaty. In that first phone call between Putin and Trump, Putin suggests that they extend the New START Treaty, the nuclear treaty, past 2021. And Trump puts down the phone and he says, "What is the New START Treaty?" He has to ask his advisors what it is. And he says, no, we don't like that treaty, as with most things that Trump's instincts are wrong on. But that's one of the places we've got to resolve the differences over the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, which would be a disaster if that breaks down. Somebody's got to talk sense into Trump about the Iran deal, and Putin is the perfect person to do that. There are so many places we can make progress, ease the tensions, work together on our common interests. Among the things that we need to do is get the United States back in the Paris Climate Accords, which Putin strongly supports. So there are so many areas in which we can make progress, and that would be a great thing.
Now, I've seen all of the episodes of The Untold History of the United States, and brilliant work it is too. When is the new edition of the book out?
Well, Oliver and I are crossing the final T's and dotting the I's right now. So we're going to get it to our publisher in the beginning of July, we hope, and they promise to move quickly on it. So it will be out in 2018. But we also, in August, we're coming out with Volume 2 of our Young Readers book for middle school students. We're going to have 4 volumes there in total. We're making great progress on our graphic novel of Untold History, so that will hopefully be out before too long also. So, but the new edition will be out sometime later this year.
Well, look, nobody should miss your tour. Nobody should not have the book on their shelves, and it's only a matter of going to YouTube and seeing the episodes. Did you say there were 10?
There are actually 12. 12. We showed 10 on Showtime and on the BBC and on television around the world, but we had 2 more episodes that are included in the box set. So you can go to Amazon and get the box set very inexpensively. The last I saw was something like $18 for the entire 12 episodes. And but it's also on Netflix. It's available in, as you say, in many ways.
Yeah. It's a pleasure, an honor, actually, talking with you. Professor Peter Kuznick from Maryland, the co-author with Oliver Stone of The Untold History of the United States.
Warachi sandals too.
Warachi sandals too. Doesn't that take you back to a different America, to the one I was just discussing with Professor Peter earlier, but nonetheless important. I am, as I have frequently said, the great-grandson of the only woman in the 19th century who emigrated from America to Scotland at a time when thousands were sailing in the opposite direction. There is no sense in which I hate the people of America. Quite the contrary. Darren Alevi says, George, glad to have you back. Hope you had a good time on holiday in Malta. Shame about the corruption with the Blair of Malta in charge and the assassination of a great Maltese journalist, Daphne Caruana Galizia. I wrote about both these people on my blog, which is current on rt.com. It wasn't a holiday. It was 2 days of quite hard work, actually, but I had forgotten quite how beautiful a place Malta is. Lizzie, as many others have, is saying on the Twitter, thank you for such a passionate and eloquent interview with George Galloway on Talk Radio. That's addressed to Lucy Masoud. And David says, Boris Johnson is affecting our country. He's a liability, is he not? Indeed, he is. And Peter says, George, what are you talking about the World Cup? I know certain members of the establishment here are pulling their hair out because it's going so well for Russia. Exactly what they didn't want, which was the fans saying how fantastic it is and how well they've been treated. The BBC and certain media outlets disgracefully tried everything to destroy and demonize the Russians for the World Cup and to spread fear amongst any would-be supporters, going how wrong they've been proven and how right I am when I say that the mainstream media is corrupt and agenda-driven. Well, it's certainly true that the rampaging racist mobs and homophobic bashers of gay people that they predicted, the coldness, the lack of hospitality that they predicted, the police brutality that they predicted, and the grimness that they predicted, all now lie as ruins on the floor. It's the best World Cup there's ever been, in my opinion. Guy's on the line. He's in Stoke-on-Trent. Go ahead, Guy.
Yeah, good evening, George.
Good evening, sir.
George, I'm calling as a retired firefighter of 30 years.
Okay.
I'm no Red Adair, but I was in charge of a watch for a while in my career.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've watched snippets of the poor watch manager in London who's been, it's almost interrogation by the barristers.
It was like the Spanish Inquisition.
It was ridiculous. But there's a couple of things I want to say. First of all, why the hell have they got the watch manager up there in the dock?
Well, exactly. Especially as the media are describing him as the fire chief. He was the fire chief of 2 engines.
Absolutely. So the first thing is he's not the person who should be up there answering questions.
Exactly.
That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Now, the second thing is the timeline. I've just got to go through the timeline quickly.
Yeah.
The fire starts before 1 a.m., 6 minutes before 1 a.m. The crew, the first firefighting crew, are in the flat 4th floor at 14 minutes past 1. So they are now at the fire. There's 4 fire engines been mobilised. At 1:26, there's video footage that fire is now spread from floor 4 to the top floor. Almost 20 floors are on fire. And just from the video footage from people who've shot, it's a huge fire. It's the big. Heaven only knows what you would do faced with that fire. At 6 minutes past 2, there's now 40 fire engines mobilised. There is no way a watch manager would be in charge. You're talking some senior rank in that London Fire Brigade. And the question I think they need to answer, and it's a tough question, is why did they decide to evacuate at 2:47 when at 1:26 one face of that building has gone from 4 to 23. There's 19 stories on fire externally, and all I can, the question's got to be raised: why did you not change your standard procedure from stay put? Because the compartmentation clearly didn't work, and without getting into why it didn't work.
Well, one of the reasons it didn't work was because the fire doors were inadequately fitted and there were no sprinklers.
Yeah, absolutely. There's numerous
and the building was clad in petrol, more or less.
I agree with what you're saying, but the point I'm trying to make is if at 126, one side of that building has gone from the fourth floor to the top, they should be thinking it's not going to plan. Let's clear these people for safety. And I think that question's got to be put not to a watch manager,
but to the fire chief. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree with you.
If the fire chief of London doesn't turn out to a fire where there's 40 fire engines in a residential tower block of 23 stories, what are they going to turn out to?
Very, very good points, Guy, and I agree absolutely with your questions, which will, I'm sure, be put by the union and by others in the inquiry. Thanks for that call. Gary Hill says, George, I can't agree with you that the present World Cup is the best World Cup there's ever been. Surely the 1970 World Cup fits this category. Pele et al. Well, the 1970 World Cup was spoiled for me by the thousands of Mexican students that were shot and huge numbers of them killed and mass arrests just before the tournament opened. But of course, the cup final with Brazil and Italy was a truly great cup final. We've yet to see the cup final here. But I advise you to look back, Gary, at the group stages of the 1970 World Cup. They were nothing like as exciting as the ones we're watching in Russia. Tad says, George, you should have seen the arguments I had with the local Labour Party, who embraced New Labour as if Blair was the new Messiah. I'm not in the least surprised. It's now unravelling. Trouble is, though, there are hundreds of Blairites still on the opposition benches who readily take their 30 pieces of silver. They're akin to an insidious disease. This is the $64,000 question, Tad. How can Jeremy Corbyn even form a Labour government with the number of Labour MPs that are on his side, with hundreds sitting behind him whose loyalty is to Blair? Let's take another call, this time from Chris in Colchester. Go ahead, Chris.
Hi, George. All right?
Mate. Yeah, good, sir.
Yeah. The reason that people, parasites like Tony Blair get away with these war crimes is because of the mainstream media. Because
they've completely rehabilitated him.
Well, yeah, of course, because the establishment doesn't want to leave the European Union. But what they do is they call Iraq a mistake and say that the run-up to Iraq were mistakes by the intelligence agencies. They weren't mistakes, they were lies. That's the crucial difference. They were drawn up in places like by people like Douglas Fife in the Office of Special Plans, a secret office, linking Al-Qaeda to Iraq, with a meeting that didn't take place in Prague between the lead hijacker Mohammed Atta and
remember
Iraqi
that one?
officials.
Front page of the Sunday Times.
Yep, I know, and they just get swept under the rug. And your guest earlier, Mr. White, made a great point that the reason also is because that they won't get prosecuted is because future wars will be harder to go through, because then there will be that deterrent, and that was the point that I wanted to make as well. It's so simple, and also the mistakes that people say, they're not mistakes about the sectarian divides. They were all talked about before the war by people like Richard Pell, Oda Jinon. They wanted these sectarian divides in Iraq.
They consciously set out to multiply them and deepen them.
Yeah, because it weakens the countries in the Middle East, and also the lies about Iraq. They were told in the 1990s by people like Paul Wolfowitz in the Project for a New American Century papers, talking about weapons of mass destruction 1,000 times, time and again, weapons of mass destruction. And then what they did after 9/11 was regurgitate the same lies and make out like they were new, after 9/11, and then we went to war based on that, and it was a disgrace. And people were called conspiracy theories about that and about the torture, but.
Well, this pejorative conspiracy theorist died today because that was the very phrase used at length by Jack Straw when we were accusing him of British complicity in the extraordinary rendition and torture of hundreds, maybe thousands of people in the so-called War on Terror. He said that we were conspiracy theorists. It turns out we were telling the truth and he was telling the lies. Chris, thanks for that call. I told you this was the University of the Airwaves. You definitely get a better class of caller and writer here. Phil in Cheltenham says, I'd like Russia to win the World Cup. What a coup that would be. And Patrick says, I agree about success of the World Cup in Russia. Maybe we should make Russophobia in public a criminal offence with severer penalties for politicians and the mainstream media, although that would probably mean putting half of the MPs deservedly in prison within a year. Thanks, Patrick. Dr. Fath URS says, George, what will happen to the likes of Blair, Straw and co regarding the torture report? I don't pay something as trivial as my road tax, TV licence, etc. The state will hound me relentlessly to this country's borders or even to jail if necessary. Very good point. Fra says, at the Cliftonville Ladies versus Linfield Ladies Cup Final at Seaview in Belfast. Great show, George. Keep her lit, and I hope it's a great cup final, Fra. The Communicipalist says we only hear about the torture and barbarism in the mainstream media after 10 years or so, although I was blogging on it myself at the time. But it makes me wonder whether the Dad Stasi are waterboarding people in the basement of Buckingham Palace, even as I type. Heaven forfend. And Waltz says, I knew the narrative would try to shift the blame onto the firefighters when about 3 weeks ago it was revealed in the press that the police were to start investigating the fire brigade actions on the night. It was announced in the media just before the firefighters began giving evidence. It's an outrage. Jason says, evening, Mr. Galloway. Jason, West Midlands. Your application for question time, may I suggest Brian Clough, the greatest manager England never had. Perfect for the job, awful for the establishment. Thanks, Jason. Well, to paraphrase Brian Clough, I'm not saying that I'd necessarily be the best presenter of BBC Question Time, but I'm definitely in the top one. Scouser Lar, my old pal, says, I voted Remain in the EU ref as I believe that the EU could be reformed. But if there's a second EU referendum, I would most definitely vote Leave because of the hideous FBPE crowd and their war criminal ringleader, Alistair Campbell. Now, it's going like hotcakes, my gig in Liverpool. The Outsiders, me and Ken Livingstone, at St. George's Hall on the 8th of September at 7:30 p.m. So it holds 500. We're getting on for 100 tickets sold in 2 days. So you better get your applications in right away. You can get the details on my Twitter feed. And Scouser Lar is definitely already there because he's told me he's in the front row or the second row. Tony X, the protest board, who made a fabulous piece of work promoting this show. I commend it to you all. Turns out that Tony, who we all knew was a good writer, is a great artist, illustrator, a graphic designer too. Tony says Article 50 is an EU construct. The UK voted to leave, so we should have sent them a Dear John letter, Dear Jean, perhaps, the day after the vote. Immediate freedom to do whatever we wanted, instead of searching for something which does not and cannot exist. And Mountain Man says May was asked not so long ago, knowing what she knows now, would she still go to war in Iraq? Answer, yes. Deranged. Deranged indeed. Linda says, evening GG, the EU have been used to feather the nests of state Tories, cronies, corrupting correct usage of the first ever rules and regs of the institution. Get me far away from humans, from a unicorn. And the communicipalist says, excellent point, George, about no referendum on the illegal war in Iraq. I was there on the march back in 2003, and I'll be up early to go to London tomorrow to march again for the health service. I've been marching since 1968. I'm marching for the people's Brexit now. You and me both. And Hedy says, I love you talking about the war. I can imagine you then in the SAS, Scottish and suave. Hedy, that's the nicest thing anybody has ever said about me. I would have been first in the line at the recruiting office at the outbreak of the Second World War. I don't want anybody ever to imagine that I'm a pacifist. I would have been there fighting fascism. Matter of fact, I'd already have fought them in Spain. Paul Booker says, I for one am so happy to have the University of the Airwaves back. Mr. Galloway may have only had a week off, but it's felt like a month. Indeed, it has also for me, Paul. I used to be a regular stand-in on other shows, but not at the moment. So it's only Friday nights now, and missing one, therefore, is quite a big hole in the whole university project. But thanks for staying loyal. Peter says, George, tell your listeners that intelligence coming out of Syria shows the white helmets preparing another false flag chemical attack. They were seen in hazmat suits loading chemicals onto mortars. This was confirmed by locals. And Terra Vita Nomadic says, I often wondered why it is known for the land of the brave or the free. Because of World War II, living in any city in the States is not different than living freely anywhere else. America is now the land of the war machine. How free is that? Well, as Professor Peter was pointing out, there are freedoms in the Constitution in the United States, which we don't have here. For example, we don't even have a Constitution. There are lots of elections, and one of them was won this very week by a young socialist woman who won the Democratic Party nomination for a congressional seat in New York, defeating a 10-term right-wing Democrat of the warmongering mold. Her platform was explicitly socialist and anti-war, and she won. So there's two aspects of freedom. First of all, senators, whether Democratic or Republican, or congresspeople, ditto, have to stand to be the candidate again before each election. And somebody can stand against them and can defeat them. And then they are the Democratic Party's candidate, however many terms the incumbent has served. That's a pretty important freedom. And there's elections every 2 years in the United States, as opposed to every 5 years here. That's also an important freedom. You elect the dog catcher, you elect the fire chief, the police chief, and all kinds of things in America. These are important freedoms. The First Amendment to the Constitution guarantees freedom of speech, a right which has been honoured much in the breach over many decades, as Abby Martin's wonderful programme that I watched this morning makes clear. But there are freedoms in the United States, and it is important to acknowledge them. There have been many brave Americans, many of whom left their guts on the beaches of Normandy in their part in 1944 in the liberation of Western Europe. And American forces fought bravely when they joined the war until its end in the Second World War. But that's where it ends, I'm afraid. But then that's where it ends for us too. Now, Graham in Fort William says Brexit's going to be the greatest thing in history for the UK. You and other people need to lay off the Tories back and let them do their job to make Britain great again. In time, we will be making great trade deals and our borders will be closed for European people to come in freely and claim benefits paid for by the UK taxpayer. That's Graham from Ward 5 in Fort William. Let's take Gary in Maidenhead on the phone. Go ahead, Gary.
Oh, good evening, George. How are you?
Yes, very well, thank you.
George, the two things I wanted to ask you about. One is, what's happened to the Skripal affair? Total silence.
Well, I'll tell you one thing that's happened.
Yeah.
We're going to spend £1 million in taxpayers' money to buy Mr. Skripal's house and D.S. Bailey's house. We'll never see either of them again, it would appear. But we are going to buy their house and destroy them. And yet it's so safe in Salisbury. The heir to the throne was cavorting there just the other day, even though we'd been told, yes, Prince Charles, Prince Charles and his good wife were touring openly in Salisbury.
That's right.
So
I did see it.
It's not quite the danger to humanity for another decade that we were told at the time. Anyway, go on, Gary.
Well, if, to use your favourite word, scintilla, if there was a scintilla of evidence that the Russians were responsible, it would be on the front pages of every newspaper.
Yeah, that's why we haven't seen it.
Not a damn dicky word, okay? And the other thing is that, Boris the buffoon was compelled to lie. That's the only thing that he could do, was to lie about the evidence. There is no evidence that the Russians are responsible.
No, we either need the evidence or we need an apology, don't we?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's disgraceful. I love this country, and I love, a hell of a lot about England. I came from South Africa, and I came over here, and it was intoxicating, the freedom after having left that crazy country.
Yeah.
But moving swiftly on, Gaza is the thing that's uppermost in my mind at the moment. Okay, to every response the Israelis have offered to their massacre of unarmed protesters, there's not been an ounce of contrition, remorse, regret, or apology for the children they murdered, and in some cases shot in the back trying to flee.
As a matter of fact, Andrew
in South Africa.
Andrew Marr was reprimanded by the BBC for drawing attention to Israel killing children in Gaza.
It does not surprise me. The BBC is not what it used to be. Back in the 60s, the BBC was a credible operation. Now it's just filled with lies and fake news. I don't even enjoy watching it anymore.
Well, I no longer watch it. I no longer watch it, and it's utterly discredited so far as I'm concerned.
And the Israelis, and I've got a lot of Israeli friends, okay, and we debate this from time to time, and we have fierce arguments about it, okay. The Israelis have used every excuse, and the old age excuse that children were used as a human shield. What mother or father would ever sacrifice their children in this way?
It's
ridiculous.
You could only think that if you thought the Palestinians were subhuman. And
Correct.
the truth is, look, I've spent a lot of time in Israel.
Yeah,
I've
so
lived
have I.
with my friends in Shankin Street, not far from Dizengoff Square in Tel Aviv, many times. I have many friends, and many of them are eminent academics as well as activists, professors at the university and so on.
Much about Dr. Finkelstein.
Well, he's a magnificent figure.
Amazing guy. I mean, his parents
He's
were
not Israeli, of
victims
course.
the Holocaust.
He's an American citizen. But
Yes,
my friends are Israelis living in Israel, in Tel Aviv. There are good people in Israel.
No question
but
of it.
they are a
No
tiny number
They're in the minority.
a tiny minority.
Yeah.
But that makes them the bravest people on the earth.
That's for sure.
In my opinion.
Yep.
Gary, thanks. Excellent call. Damien says, what do you think of our socialist president, Michael D. Higgins, who sits in the 91-bedroom mansion in the Phoenix Park, collecting his 11 pensions, while families who have been evicted from their homes by vulture funds sleep on the streets? Well, I can't go with you on that, Damien. I think that Michael D. Higgins is the best president that Ireland has ever had. The president of Ireland, as you well know, does not run the government of Ireland. Your complaint would be better directed to the elected government of the Republic of Ireland rather than Higgins. Linda says, evening GG, the USA is not an empire, they say. Empire State Building. Enough said. From a unicorn. What do you mean unicorn, Linda? And Peter says, American empire, ha! Their only mates are the mad Israelis. The rest of the world can't stand them. Delusions of grandeur. Well, Peter, that's not strictly true. The Marshall Islands like them. Vanuatu like them. Micronesia like them. In fact, they like them so much they regularly are the only people voting alongside them in the United Nations. Grant in Stoke-on-Trent's on the line. Go ahead, Grant.
Oh, hi, George. I'm really excited to talk to you.
Good. Is this your first time?
Yeah, first
Excellent.
time. And I'm coming to see you with Ken Livingston at
Oh,
St.
fantastic.
George's Hall in Liverpool.
Fantastic. Have you got your tickets yet?
But I've got my tickets,
Excellent.
yeah. It was only £11, so brilliant. So that's all sorted.
Good.
On the subject of Jeremy Corbyn, because we've been talking about Jeremy Corbyn,
yes.
I think, personally in my view, and probably from the perspective of many young people, is simply the reason he's gained such popularity is on the basis that he is Jeremy Corbyn. Like, we've seen a lot of the sort of machine-washed politicians, the likes of Tony Blair, the likes of Alistair Campbell, and they're just increasingly becoming so transparent in their insincerity.
That was true in the US too. You see, that's another reason why Trump won, because he was not seen to be like them. Whether he is or not is another matter, but he wasn't seen to be one of these professional, blow-dried and facially freezed with a heart of ice. He was seen to be flesh and blood, and that's what Corbyn's seen like.
Well, yeah, and I certainly think that is true regarding Jeremy Corbyn, and despite that, I suppose the mainstream media and the sneering in the same way with Trump and in the same way with Corbyn did essentially shoot themselves in their own foot.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing, isn't it?
People
the more they attack Corbyn, the better he seems to do. It's one of the mysteries of this age.
It's almost as though, I think people were perceived as the mainstream media, so the BBC, the Blairite Broadcasting Corporation, telling people what they should be doing. So I'm incredibly happy that people are seeing through that kind of thing, and that we're living in an age where
that's right. And of course, the newspapers are not in fact, the main purpose for the newspapers now is to provide newspaper review platforms for the broadcast media. And thus the prejudices of the print media can begin to set the agenda for the next day's broadcast media. And that's something that is a real worry and a real problem. Because if all the print media is printing the same bilge, then the broadcast media, in reviewing it, is perpetuating that bilge as the prevailing narrative. But the newspapers now are losing money hand over fist. The Evening Standard, now edited by George Osborne, has gone from a 2.9 million profit last year to a 10 million loss this year. And that's a free newspaper. So
a 10 million loss.
10 million loss announced today. Last year, 2.9 million profit. He's done for the Evening Standard what he did for the country's finances.
Well, I hope similar things happen with the Sun newspaper. That's all I can say.
All the newspapers are losing money and circulation hand over fist. And some of them are becoming websites. I mean, the Independent's now just a website.
Well, yeah, to the best of my belief, that is how they monitor the popularity, by clicks nowadays, and not by who's actually buying the newspapers. On the subject where I probably am in some agreement with mainstream media, I'm not entirely sure if I'm just slightly misled or if you can convince me otherwise, is regarding the subject of Brexit. I still am a Remainer. I did vote Remain. It's not that
There's no point now in being a Remainer, Grant. I mean, that horse has bolted. What matters now is what kind of Brexit and what kind of Britain. The decision is made. There was a people's vote, and the people's vote was clear.
Well,
Brexit won. It's not going to be reopened. There'd be a civil war in this country if Brexit were reopened.
you're probably going to really disagree with me and get angry and probably completely shut me down on this.
No, I never do that.
But one thing I do think is that I don't believe that the referendum was democratic, and the reason
it doesn't matter what you believe about that, Grant.
Well,
I'm sorry,
no, the reason
Grant,
I don't believe
Grant,
that is because
Grant,
you're not letting me finish.
No, I'm letting you finish. No, I'm going to let you finish. I'm going to let you come back.
The outcome.
No, I'm going to let you come back. Grant,
the outcome
Grant,
because we have not
Grant,
had
shut up. I'm going to let you come back. I'm responding to you. It doesn't matter what you think about the referendum. The referendum is over. The decision is in. We're leaving the European Union. All that matters now is what kind of Britain we'll have afterwards. You can shuffle about in your soft shoes on the streets of London. You can waft your cologne as you go by with your Waitrose bag every Saturday if you like. That is closed. We're leaving the European Union. And frankly, all you're doing with this endless whining about the decision and insulting the people who were in the majority who made it is making people hate the Remain camp more and more each day. Over to you.
So I have no right to express my view.
You do have a right. You are expressing your view, but it doesn't matter. Your view doesn't matter. The people voted. End of. Full stop. That's what people like you have got to realise. And by the way, you're calling me from Stoke-on-Trent, which is Brexit Central. More people voted for Brexit in Stoke than anywhere else. We've lost him. Maybe he'll resume. Maybe he'll resume this conversation with me up in Liverpool. At least he's bought 2 tickets. Now, let me read a couple, then I'll go to a break. Peter says, you're absolutely right. The money they're making at the moment, demonizing Russia, especially with Eastern Europe, is phenomenal. Make peace with Russia and the military-industrial complex will lose billions upon billions. Trump does want peace, but the establishment will never let this happen. Peter, let me give you just one fact in support of your SMS. When Trump met Kim in Singapore and declared peace on the Korean Peninsula, billions of dollars were lost in the stock market, in the shares of weapons of war. It's been a Beach Boys night because it was so sunny and hot when I came. It was 33 degrees, I think it was, this afternoon. What's that in real money? 66, 86, that's 93. Mad hot it was, so I thought some beach music would be in order. We've got the lovely legend that is Norma in Bristol. Norma, welcome.
Hello, we missed you last week.
Thank you. I missed it too.
Yes. It's just a couple of things, really. There's a bit of sort of further progress on uniting Ireland, which would solve all our Brexit problems and would quicken it up.
Yep.
The withdrawal. Now, do you think
at a stroke?
Eh?
It would.
Totally.
It would solve the issue at a stroke, and it's coming, Norma. I firmly believe if I live a normal lifespan, I will see a united Ireland. I
but do you think in the not too distant future it could happen?
Yes.
Or is that just wishful thinking?
No,
because
no.
The Berlin Wall came down.
If I live as I hope to, another 20 years. We'll be well into a united Ireland by then.
No,
I'm sure
but that's not. I'm older than you. I want to see it happen.
Yeah.
After all, the Berlin Wall came down with East and West quite suddenly, didn't it?
Yeah.
And it's in their interests, really, in lots of ways, because they could stay in the EU, and if they could.
Well, the majority of them in the north want to stay in the EU, so the easiest way to stay in the EU is to join the Republic of Ireland. Of course, there's more work to be done to assure the Protestant minority, as it would then be, that their way of life, their religion, their culture, and so on would be protected and enshrined in the Constitution and so on. And I hope that the Republicans and those who support a united Ireland are turning their mind to that because it's important that all traditions are accommodated in the united Irish Republic and feel that they have some ownership of it.
And it wouldn't have that with Brexit, wouldn't it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the only logical border between us and the European Union is down the middle of the Irish Sea, and that's the only logical border between us and Ireland.
Yeah, and after all, I'm not anti any of the people in Ireland particularly, but they don't vote Liberal, Labour, Conservative, Lib Dem, whatever. I don't think...
it's up to them.
They could do their own.
Yeah, but I mean, the Conservatives could stand there if they wanted, so could the Liberals, so could Labour.
They wouldn't get
But
very
they
far.
don't for the precise reason that Ireland is another country, and it should have been a united... it's only a small island, after all. It should have been a united country since 1921.
The other thing, George, is I don't know whether... Have you got an opinion on Prince William going to Israel and Palestine? Should it have been the right person?
No, he shouldn't have gone. And no British royal has ever gone before. And there's a reason for that. Because Britain's historic responsibility for the disaster that is Israel-Palestine is virtually total, certainly on a historical level. And our soldiers and policemen and other civil servants were slaughtered there in considerable numbers by the Israeli terror gangs. And Prince William is not even being allowed to lay a wreath, for example, at the hotel he is staying in. Can you believe that? He's staying in the King David Hotel, where 92 of our people were murdered in the lifetime of you.
Yep. Well, to be honest, I just think it's the wrong person altogether, and I wasn't very happy about it.
I think he's done as well as he could.
Well, I'm sure he has, but I don't think it should have been him.
He's a fine young man, and he's done as well as he could, but he should never have been sent there.
Right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Norma. It's a delight to hear your voice again. Tony says the truth of the matter is Trump would rather do deals with Russia than do deals with the military-industrial complex, who use Russia or any other convenient enemy to justify and bolster their own reason for existence. Perfectly encapsulated. Gus is on the line from Glasgow on Prince William. Go ahead, Gus.
Yes, hello, George. A great show again.
Thanks, mate.
I missed you last week.
Thank you.
Yes, Prince William makes me sick.
That's a bit harsh, Gus.
Yes, well, I'm only speaking my own feeling, because everything seems to be Israeli and not Palestine.
Well, he did meet with the leader of the so-called Palestine National Authority, Abbas, and he did meet some of the refugees. I think he visited a camp. So, in the difficult gig that he had, Gus, I think he's done not too badly.
Yeah, well, I think that's just all a front.
Well, who knows what's going on in his own mind? I have a feeling that what's going on in his own mind is not what Mr. Netanyahu would like.
Yes, well, hopefully.
Yeah,
because
none of them have gone before, Gus. You know that?
George.
None of them have gone before. That's a very significant thing. No British royal has ever gone there before, and that I think is important. Gus, thanks for your call, pal. I'm running out of time, so I need to press on. It's been a pleasure talking to you. The Red Resistance says, excellent chat on the USA socialist secret history, George. Pertinent in the week that saw a true socialist in the form of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez arrive on the US political scene in a huge way. Just maybe times are a-changing for the better. This young woman has been everywhere on every talk show. She's made a tremendous splash. Mr. R says, great to have you back. Bill Maher and Simler appeared to promote socialism around the US election, but they now fall back on the neoliberal neocon agenda. Are they abandoning Bernie? How on earth can they reform the Democratic Party if they are so intransigent? Don't get me started on Bill Maher, please. Let's talk to Frank, who's in St Albans. Go ahead, Frank.
Hello, mate.
Hi, sir.
You know what? Great to talk to you, George.
Thank you, sir.
George, you know what? You've always spoken from the heart, and you actually, it's people like you, George, that actually give us a little bit to think about. George, I'm going to ask you one thing. Listen, even though I was born in this country, my parents come from Sicily, and I go back to Sicily every single year. I got married out there 6 years ago, and they said, George, we've got a serious problem here, bruv. In Sicily, we've just had we've got a joint government.
Yeah, coalition government, yeah.
Yep, Matteo Salvini and Luigi Di Maio, Cinque Stelle and Lega. Now, Lega, when the Bossi, you know who I'm talking about.
Yes.
Bossi, unfortunately, didn't have any votes in Sicily. This election, the Lega had 19.8% votes in Sicily alone because we wanted a change in government. George, you know when you hear, about talking about, what countries have to go through? Listen, my friend, I come from an island where when I grew up, and I saw my grandfather, working on his land to provide food for the family. At this present moment in Italy, we have, especially in Sicily, there's 1.8 million people that are on poverty. There's a 5 million people population in Sicily. It's the biggest island in the Med.
Yeah.
George, when you hear figures coming through and are saying in Sicily, George, I've seen it with my eyes. If you go to Palermo in Sicily and you see the amount of poverty of these poor people coming onto this.
The EU didn't do much for Sicily.
Exactly. That's where I'm coming from, George.
Yeah.
We've got a problem here in Sicily, and I'm going to tell you this, because when you've got corrupted government and officials, and they're getting paid by the EU 37.5 euros per person per day, setting up these camps, until you get rid of all the corruption, you ain't going to resolve this.
No, unfortunately we can't go too deeply into it, given the hour. But the truth is, Italy has every right to say, we cannot be the repository of a human wave of refugees coming from wars that were started by somebody else.
Correct, George. Listen, when Gaddafi they got rid of him in Libya, this is where the problem started.
Of course it is. The doors were blown open and Africa poured out.
Yeah, so us in Sicily, where I come from, and I've got property out there. George, if you went to Sicily, mate, in the south of Italy, we make everybody feel welcomed. But enough is enough now, mate.
Yeah.
And we have to start thinking about, when I go back home, I'm not going to get emotional here. When I see these people, even my own people in my village, they've got no work. It's sad. It's very sad.
It's an outrage that Italy and Greece and other countries outside the EU, like Turkey, like Jordan, like Lebanon, have been left holding millions of refugees from wars started by Britain, the United States, and France. And particularly Britain and the United States. But Britain and the United States take virtually no refugees, whilst Italy and Greece, that never started these wars, are being expected somehow to absorb millions of people and vote for the politicians who agree to it. It's just not tenable. Helen Adey says, I'm late to the party tonight, having been to a Labour Party AGM. Things are changing slowly, George, but they are changing. More new faces and the old guard breaking up. please implore your Labour Party member listeners to get involved and active in their local branches. We need them. Very well said, Helen, and I certainly endorse your message. Roger Gall says, I'm sure that our current Foreign Secretary would not allow the US to do anything underhand. Terry Eaton says, George, my 19-year-old son knows that if all his generation vote Labour at the next election, there will be a massive landslide for Corbyn. The Tories have no attraction for the youth of this country. Terry, that's why they're so afraid, so very afraid. And David Woolnough says, I worked in construction and compartmentalisation was everything. The question is for me is why has this failed? And who had knowledge that it did not conform? The fire brigade had every right to think that this was correct. Hence, stay put. And Peter says, let's hope there are 2 police officers en route to Mr. Bung Straw's door before the show is over. That's from Peter in Glasgow. And an SMS says, George, it's Smithy the Blue Nose here. Give us a mention. I'm on my way to the river Erne for the sea trout. The best of luck to you, Smithy. Hope you catch a big one. Tom Jarvis says, evening, Gigi. How about Richard Madeley to present Question Time? The show would be over in 5 minutes. That's very good. Very witty. Terry says, we'll never get rid of these Blairites at grassroots unless we carry the youth with us who have no allegiance to the warmongering Blair. Fra says, 2-1 to Linfield at half-time. If the fire brigade made mistakes, should they not be held to account? It's not their bravery that's being questioned, it's their actions. If lives were lost due to an inadequate or inappropriate response, surely we can question that. Bit surprised, Fra, at that. Dr. Fath, URS, says, any chance of playing at some time in the future something by the great Woody Guthrie, a huge influence on a young Mr. Bobby Zimmerman? Perhaps Pastures of Plenty would be most apt for this country at present. Great song, actually, Doctor. And Bass Players Union, my own union, says, disappointed not to be able to attend your show in Liverpool with Ken on September 8th. How about you two visiting Manchester on an alternative date, please? I think it'll be a while before we make it to Manchester. We've got 4 or 5 other dates in mind before that. Let's take a break for some capitalist messages. Vibrations from the seminal album Sounds, which was a really groundbreaking album at the time. Tony X says, complaining about Michael D. Higgins in relation to Irish policy is like complaining about the Queen for Tory policies. Very well said indeed. The Irish president is a symbolic post. He's the head of state. He has no power at all in the government. And him giving away his pensions to the homeless in Dublin wouldn't go far. Tim in Evesham. Where did I used to hear Evesham? I think it was on Radio Luxembourg back in the day. Evesham, Evesham. It's Tim, and he's on now. Go ahead, Tim.
Hi, George.
Hi there.
I was just thinking to thank you for your kind words about the RAF.
Yes, thank you. Well, they're heroes to me. If not for them, I'd be speaking to you in German right now.
I'm the proud son of a Battle of Britain pilot who died 3 years ago.
We don't make nearly enough of the Battle of Britain. We should have a proper celebration, national celebration every year. If it was our finest hour, which undoubtedly was, then why does it pass so unremarked every year?
He was an extremely brave man, George, and always. And also, my uncle, he ended up an air marshal. He was a very, very proud Scot. He came from Glasgow,
and he ended up an air marshal. My goodness.
He did. Yeah. And his brother, who lost a leg in Italy, married George Orwell's sister and brought up George Orwell's son.
Oh, my goodness, that is a remarkable story, Tim.
And knowing my uncle, I was very close to him. It was like touching history. I met many nice people through him.
Extraordinary story.
Mm-hmm.
Extraordinary story. Well, I mean, it is true. Before the United States entered the war, or even would have thought about it, before the Soviet Union entered the war, we were all that there was.
That's
the
right.
only unconquered place.
That's it.
And if not for the gallantry and skill of our airmen and women, and there were no women pilots then, but there were women in the service, of course. There were also Commonwealth
in the
people.
service, yeah.
There were people from what is now the Commonwealth, then the Empire. There were Polish people, Canadians, and many others. It was, and I was really quite moved by the Mall this evening in the sun, as all these RAF flags were there. It reminded me of the greatness of that hour.
Well, it was a great hour, wasn't it? And my uncle had a Polish squadron that he looked after in one of his stations, and he said they were the bravest people he'd ever met. And I agree with you, George, what you say about Russia. I mean, they won the war, didn't they, at the end?
Without a doubt. I mean, there would have been no war to win if it wasn't for us, but they definitely won it.
And I think that we haven't been treating them all that well just recently. I think it's very easy to make Putin into what they want to make him into, but there's another agenda there, isn't there?
There is, Tim. I'm very glad to have met you. I hope this is not the last time that we talk. Are you on Twitter, Tim?
No, I'm not on Twitter. No. I was on your because I've been a long-term listener to your shows, and I was on. You had a website at one time with which...
No, I've still got one. Drop me a line on the website, would you please, Tim?
I will do so.
I'd like to stay in touch with you. That's Tim.
I've been a Conservative voter, only because I haven't had much opportunity to vote for anybody else of any quality. I was born in Birkenhead in 1941, and if I was still living in Birkenhead, I'd definitely vote for Frank Field.
And you'd be at my show in St George's Hall.
I would.
Maybe we'll come down to Worcestershire. Tim, it's fantastic
was a Norwegian who moved to Liverpool, so we got lots of Scottish connections.
Fantastic to talk to you, my friend. I really appreciate it. Thanks for that. James is in Warrington. Go ahead, James.
Good evening, George.
Good evening, sir.
Privileged to speak to you.
No, the honour's mine. Thank you.
George, I don't know if you've had a chance to see the SNP government in Scotland change
I can barely bring myself to look.
I know, me the same. Have changed their cabinet, half the cabinet this week. Did you have a chance to see it, George?
I haven't, but I knew there was a big cabinet reshuffle. Yes.
Yes. One of the parties involved, one of the people involved, didn't last a day apparently. But,
oh, really?
No. Have a read up on it, George. I know you're busy.
I will.
Guy.
Yeah, no, I will.
But the reason is really to speak about this. Going back a few weeks ago was this Growth Commission report. I don't know if you've had a chance to sort of read it, but I'll give you the.
Tell us, summarise it.
I'll summarise it, which is quite easy. Basically, they're going to use the pound in independence for at least 10 years.
If we agree.
They're going to use it anyway, George. They're saying.
No, yeah, but we've already been through that in the campaign. You cannot use a note issued by the Bank of England without the Bank of England's permission.
Correct. And as you always say, George, the clue's in the name.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, the Bank of England. But I think I fought the campaign, in 2014. I was up there many a time. And the thing that always, my left-wing colleagues always said to me, oh, well, they're going to paint this wonderful new, way of life. And as I always said to them, socialism, not nationalism.
Exactly.
And I still don't understand how people on the so-called left say to me, we'll be a beacon for you. I said, well, what about the beacon? I don't want beacons. I want people in unity with me.
Exactly.
In Warrington, in Liverpool, in Manchester, in Glasgow.
I know exactly the kind of people who talk about things as beacons. And it turns out that these lights that they call beacons are very quickly extinguished. The idea that the Scottish working people should leave Liverpool for Latvia is utterly fanciful. that they should use a currency over which they have no control, and that the owners of the currency would allow people to use their currency over whom they had no control is absurd. And of course, the SNP prospectus is that Scotland will leave Britain, its internal market, its single market, and apply to join the European Union. Any new applicant to the European Union has to join the euro.
Yes.
So even if allowed to join the European Union, they wouldn't be using the pound, they'd be using the euro. And to use the euro, you must agree to the convergence terms, which means a £10 billion a year cut in Scottish public expenditure, which the country literally could not survive. It would be reduced to absolute penury if public expenditure was cut by £10 billion. James, I wish we had more time, but I must take a last call. Thanks for yours, from Lizzie in Gloucester. Go ahead, Liz.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. The better for hearing from you.
Well, we've certainly missed you.
Thank you.
Well, I said earlier, I've been trying to think of something that I could disagree with you on.
Yeah.
So I decided the only option is we must talk about Danny Dyer.
I thought he was wonderful last night.
He was, wasn't he?
He was absolutely wonderful. I've never heard of him before, or seen him, or his daughter, or Love Island. But he was amazing. And now that I learn he's a Brexit supporter, it made him even more of a hero. Even more of a hero in my eyes. I tried to get him on tonight, but he didn't return my call.
Oh, what a surprise!
Well, I think he's maybe busy. We can't pay the kind of fees that Piers Morgan can pay. You know.
Yes, of course. Well, why do you think he got such a reception? Do you think it was purely because of the name calling of David Cameron?
I think people really hate Cameron. I think people really hate David Cameron, and they feel that he's walked away from the country, having left it in, let's face it, a bit of a mess.
Absolutely. And I also wanted to mention Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I don't know if I'm saying that
She's wonderful.
right.
I spoke of her earlier, yeah.
Yes, she was called a millennial in all of our press to avoid the dreaded socialist word.
Yeah.
But she's
imagine a
essentially
socialist congresswoman.
Pardon?
Imagine a socialist congresswoman.
Yeah.
A young, beautiful woman, eloquent, and a socialist in America, in New York, in Congress. My goodness, that's going to be fun.
I think Bernie will be first up to congratulate her.
Well, she's a Bernie supporter.
Of course.
And let's hope she ends up as his successor.
Well, it was lovely to talk to you, George.
And you, Lizzie, I see your name, of course, on my Twitter feed all the time. And it's beautiful to hear your voice. Thank you very much indeed. And having spoken with Lizzie on the phone, I now read Tony X, the protest board. No, I've already read it. Tony, by the way, when are you going to phone in this show? We need to hear your voice. Eddie in Islington says, George, I could never understand weapons of mass destruction. If Iraq had them, so what? Because then they would never have been invaded. Also, George, remember Chris Bryant, possible one of the mutineers against Jeremy Corbyn, made the comment to ban RT, probably the greatest news programme ever. Just brilliant. And the legend that is John Pilger. His recent speech and support for Julian Assange was awesome. George, you must get back on Question Time now. Great show, as usual. Thanks, Eddie. I haven't been on Question Time for 2 years, and I'll never be on it again, unless they make me the presenter. Terra Vita Nomadic says, a hypothetical question for George Galloway. If you were to swim over the Irish Sea and stand for election, what party would you represent, or would you go it alone? I'd go it Sinn Féin, ourselves alone. And Marie, my old friend, says, I'd love to see you and Ken for London in Scotland. Hope the gig in Liverpool on September the 7th is the first of many. Brilliant show tonight, as always. Marie, I wonder if we'd get a good crowd in Scotland. Or I wonder if Scotland has become something separate from the politics that Ken and me represent. It's a good question, that one. Maybe you can let me know on the social media what you think the answer is. A slogan for Brexiteers: hip, hip, hurrah, it's anchors away. We are floating towards New York Bay. I knew all you lying so spoilt my ballot, says Madge. And John Hedges says, listening to George Galloway reminds the BBC he's applied to be the new host of Question Time. I don't agree with GG on everything he's said or done, but he would shake Question Time out of its lethargy with his forensic and challenging questioning. You're right, John. That might be why I don't get the gig. I'll tell you what, I'd put 20% on the audience right away. There would be a 20% leap in the audience if I was presenting it. They've told me many times that when I'm on it, on the panel, the audience is significantly larger. But I've made them the promise that I'll put 20% on their audience, which is sadly declining, though all too understandably. My old friend Mal in Belfast says, George, welcome back. Re-Brexit. You're right about the Remainers stifling progress on leaving. If the vote had have went the other way, Leavers would have left it and accepted it and moved on. I'm constantly outraged at people who won't let go. Thank you, Mal. I'm not sure that's accurate, but the difference is the Leavers wouldn't have had the opportunity to bring it to a close. The Remainers think they still do, although I believe they are very badly wrong. Well, it's been marvellous for me. I hope it was for you, and if it was, come back next week at the same time and the same place and bring another listener with you. This has been the Open University of the Airwaves. This has been the mother of all talk shows.